if that's okay. So please feel free, if you don't want to be recorded, to go from there. Braden, I'm sorry for the interruption.
No, it's good. We're moving. It's an important thing to do. Just to get us started today with some thoughts as we launch off, we want to turn it over to Reverend McGee to give us some perspective as we start the day.
Good morning, or good afternoon, I guess, to some. Let me begin by contextualizing, I think, how I land here best is because of being the founding director of the National Public Housing Museum in Chicago, Illinois. And of course, now officially being a professor of practice in social justice at Newcastle University as of last week. It is official. So I'm really excited about having that role. The National Public Housing Museum, as you're probably aware, in its inception, is and was committed to being a living cultural experience on social justice and human rights, illuminating the power of place and memory. Our original mantra that I was key in creating was that we are more than objects and artifacts. We're the sum of our stories. Ruth Abrams, who of course is the founder of the Tenement Museum and International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, amongst other things, who I try to keep up with, was very fundamental in the foundation of the Public Housing Museum's vision and mission. For me, the museum became a place where we could look at and explore otherness, whether considering Immanuel Kant's notion of categories of ways of thinking, or arguing that categories were necessary for us to be able to experience the physical world. At one point, he expounds that the most critical feature distinguishing our relationship to other people was our relationships with inanimate objects around this notion of moral law. Even if we looked at Jacques Lacan's distinction of small a other, considering the counterpart of the mirror of ourselves and an equal partner in dialogue as juxtaposed to the big A, right? The whole ideal of otherness being something within itself was a place of exploring all of these notions within the museum. I even often had to consider the juxtaposition between an Aristotle and a Michael Sandel about justice, about distributive justice. So the museum became this place where we looked at the role of government and democracy, the meaning of the public good, public health, public education, public policy, and of course, public housing. It was a place of looking at economics, everything from poverty to prosperity, and the narratives that would come from the place and the narratives that would be created by the place. I think of my entire time there, my favorite exhibit was when I led the research on the sound, the soul, and the syncopation of public housing, looking at this close knit between what we hear in places and how it was interpreted through the music from Barbra Streisand to Kenny Rogers to Diana Ross to rapper Lupe Fiasco, how place became so important and how we could miss the narratives and the stories that came out of them if we were not conscious as to what was going on. I believe that the blended role of cultural institutions and academic institutions surrounds how we contextualize things, history and narratives, research, teaching, and learning, to bring to bear consciousness and memory, that nothing is lost when we explore heritage and culture. And how do we ensure that we are creating portals where there is significance and consideration around creativity and compassion and consciousness as it relates to culture. And in culture, the term culture is of course based upon the premise of social dominance that emphasizes practices, discourses, and material expressions, which over time express continuities or discontinuities of social meanings of life held in common spaces. And I think that there is this amazing opportunity to explore questions of environment and change in the ways that culture leads us and it guides us. and to understanding culture as being fluid, being a part of organizational structures. Equally important to really understand that culture is about both the built and the lived environment, as is heritage about both the tangible and the intangible. Also, I think significant are some historical parallels, specifically, in particular, between America and the British lived experience. Both have dealt with the rapid industrialization movements. Both have had population and change movements, immigration and migration, the rise and the fall of the working and the middle class, slum clearances, and the demand and design of large-scale social housing, along with the collapse of industries and the shifting patterns to service-based and unskilled labor. Both have experienced the decay of built environments and their effects that has defined places from Milwaukee to Manchester, Baltimore to Birmingham, Chicago to Newcastle. And of course, the challenges of urban post-industrialization has affected countries around the world. But it is clear that many of the specific characteristics of cities in the American Rust Belt are mirrored by the experience of the British Midlands and the north of England. The suburban environments, for example, is a phenomenon particular to the US and to the UK, as many of the shared challenges around ethnic and social division also in both countries. However, most importantly, I believe that universities, as long-held beacons of intellectual curiosity and knowledge generation, have a critical role in the moments that we're in. Rather than just being ivory towers that become iron cages, I believe that there are these amazing moments to define culture and heritage in incredible ways. Again, culture in terms of both the tangible and intangible heritage from the built and lived environment. In the midst of all of our global challenges, the role of universities are and remain critical in lots of ways, to the distribution of housing and wealth, to rebuilding the decayed built environment and mobilizing the creative roles of community action, to being engaged in issues from sexism to racism, from xenophobia to homophobia. There's a place of combining all this to have and to share our values and a sense of identity. And I'm excited to just be in the space with you to assert that this is an opportunity for dialogue about social change and innovation, and to be brave, not to be safe. We often talk about safe spaces, but to create brave spaces that can change the future, because I believe that that is our responsibility and our goal, to be change agents towards the future. So thank you for allowing me to share for a few moments this morning or afternoon.
Thank you so much, both for the intellectual framing of this, and then also the direct charge for what we need to be taking on. And finally, for sort of modeling what this particular connection could look like in your own lived experience of working physically in multiple places and between organizations as well. So thanks so much. All right, and so we're gonna bring on our first set of folks to talk now and to be our provocateurs. So we've got Areti and Nick and Sarah Jenks, and has Dennis made it on yet? The internet where he is not always perfect. So hopefully if Dennis can make it at some point. And what we would ask you all is to just get us started with the idea of what is at the heart of making dialogue work? Areti, would you like to lead us off?
Hello, everybody. My name is Areti Galani. I'm based in Newcastle University. in Media Culture Heritage, kind of the unit in the School of Arts and Cultures. So I'm very pleased to be here today. And I was given the task to answer the first couple of questions in this session. So I wanted to start this short provocation with a quote from an interview. As a part of the Cohere project, the recent European funded project, a few of the colleagues who worked on that are on this call as well. I researched with other colleagues how cultural institutions might connect ideas of dialogue with the use of digital technologies. We also carried interviews with some senior members of staff in a number of European museums as part of that. And although our discussions revolved primarily around the role of digital technologies in dialogic museum practice, we also asked all our participants to give us their view of what dialogue is. And one of the definitions struck a chord, and it was from one of the interviewees in Polin, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, who pointed out that dialogue is when you are open and when you listen. It's a very simple answer. In this respect, I suggest that the act of listening to the voice of the other and the right to be listened to make dialogue work. This understanding of listening assumes that the right to speak is contingent to the obligation to listen. So reciprocity is the key here. This, however, does not mean that dialogue needs to convert the other to one's own viewpoint and resolve or cede all differences of opinion. Julia Wood, writing on dialogue, affirms that dialogue does not necessarily idealize or seek common ground, because we're all aware that what constitutes common ground is often skewed and defined by power relationship and dynamics. Rather than the reproductive goal of finding common ground or resolving differences, Wood continues, dialogue allows differences to exist without trying to resolve, overcome, synthesize, or otherwise tame them. Therefore, although listening as a key characteristic of an authentic dialogue does not require anyone to give up their position, it at the same time presumes that participants or interlocutors are open to the fact that conflict and tension can be potentially useful and productive dimensions of dialogue. So accepting tension and conflict as a productive dimension of dialogue also allows us to bring imagination at the heart of making dialogue work, in my opinion. Coming from Greece, I suppose I'm allowed to make one short reference to Plato's Socratic dialogues here. In Plato's work, dialogue is used as a technique to highlight and explore conflictual positions and inconsistencies in the statements of his interlocutors. The highlighting of inherent conflict and tension in one's views of the world would then lead to further exploration and knowledge about oneself and about others, and ultimately to a better world, or a more just and perhaps democratic world, although Plato's motives were not always that altruistic. How can we then work with these ideas of inherent conflict, tension, and inconsistency when we design dialogic processes? So I think that that's kind of the crux of the matter that makes dialogue work. And so my speculation from my work in heritage design practices, especially around digital design, is that if we are able to create dialogic processes in which participants can safely and, as we've heard, bravely imagine alternative ways in which conflictual positions may coexist, then we might stand a good chance of also enabling longer term change. So that was my provocation.
Thank you. And thanks for getting us started with all of that. Sarah Jenks, would you go next?
Sure. Good morning. I'm from the East Coast of the US. I am in Washington, DC, and I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of a practitioner. I have been for over 13 years the Director of Education and Interpretation at Ford's Theater in Washington, DC. Ford's Theater is the place where Abraham Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated in 1865, over 150 years ago. And yet it remains a historic site and has been a place of pilgrimage for many, many of those years. And what I want to speak to, for the first thing I want to say is that when Braden asked me to participate today, I immediately wrote him back and told him that I had nothing to say and that I was not an appropriate person to serve on this panel. And thankfully, he wrote back and explained all the reasons why I was wrong. But the reason that I say that is that I think sometimes, especially in working with the coalition, which we have for many years, one comes to understand the arc of dialogue and the four truths, which are some of the kind of heart of the theory of the coalition, to be fairly formal. And I want to provoke this group by saying that I think actually they are jumping off points. And especially as a practitioner, it's important to remember that there are a lot of ways to engage in dialogue, and especially this past year, that's been important since we aren't able to be in the same places for the most part. And so what I want to do is offer 3 examples of how we have engaged in dialogue in the past year, and they're very different from one another. The first one is that we have made very good use of our website as a place to experiment with different kinds of interpretation. Actually, we did this even before the pandemic, because it's more flexible and less expensive to try out interpretation on our website than it is to change our exhibits. We have exhibits in the basement of the theater and also across the street from the theater that investigate the presidency of Abraham Lincoln and also the evolution of his legacy after the assassination. And those exhibits are permanent, more or less. They've been around for about 10 years, and our interpretation has certainly changed in those years. So one thing that we have worked hard to do is to investigate the stories of people other than the main players in the assassination story. That means trying to surface voices of people who may not have been in positions of power, and particularly African-American voices. We've worked really hard on identifying those in court transcripts and in other kinds of narratives, and putting those stories on our website. And what we've managed to do is really to tell the story of the assassination through the voices of those who experienced it, whether in person or second or third hand. So that's the first way that I would position dialogue taking place, is that it's in fact, there's value to dialogue existing in the voices of those in the past.
And Sarah,
secondly,
maybe time for one more quick
okay,
example.
I can do one more quick example.
Yep.
Secondly, we have in the past year started using provocative questions and as surveys on our website, so that we're actually asking visitors to engage with us in response to qualitative questions on the website. And an instance of this is that the gun that was used to kill the president was dropped in the box and has been in the hands of the government since it was used. And it's now on display in our museum, as it has been for about 50 years. And that is something that we're questioning as an institution in a country where gun violence is very prevalent. And so we now ask on the website a pop-up question that says, should this gun, a murder weapon, be displayed? And we just started doing that in January, and we have gotten about 150 responses since then on the website. And we're now trying to figure out how we can display those responses as part of the website, so that it's not just asking, but it becomes a multi-pronged dialogue.
Thank you. And last for this section, Nick Morgan.
All right, hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here again. I'm in Newcastle, and I'm part of the Screening Violence Project, which is a study of imaginaries of conflict and post-conflict in 5 different countries. And everything, I should preface everything I'm going to say by noting that it refers really to my own experiences of coordinating the Colombian section of this project. Now, we were asked to provide provocations, and in a sense, the question is a provocation in itself because it demands so much scrutiny. There's an underlying assumption that dialogue is a good thing, which out of context is hard to dismiss. Not liking dialogues, like not liking democracy or puppies or freedom or whatever it is. And yet there is a question about who talks to whom and in what circumstances. And without understanding the context, then we can't even begin to pose the question about what lies at the heart of successful dialogue. Now, in the case of the Colombian Peace Accords, for example, there were constant references to the dialogue going on in Havana. Now, it ended up not being a dialogue between the deaf, as the Colombian saying has it, because an agreement was finally reached in which significant compromises took place. But it was also a dialogue that caused tremendous anxiety for a range of actors who felt that they were excluded from conversations that were going on behind closed doors. This was an agreement that had implications for people who were going to be directly influenced by the agreements, yet whose access to the talks depended on the kind of relationship they had with those who were doing the talking. In a sense, of course, a whole society was implicated in this process. And the failure to engage with a broader range of opinion, to explain and clarify what was at stake and what was finally agreed, made it much easier for the enemies of the peace process to sabotage it, spreading disinformation and downright lies in order to get people to vote no in the plebiscite that was supposed to ratify the agreement. So in a sense then, for dialogue to work, and we'll talk a bit more about that later, it needs to comprise a polyphony of voices rather than simply a discussion between erstwhile adversaries. Now, what this kind of context, well, the question then is what kind of context allows for the kind of dialogue I'm imagining here? The problem with the word dialogue is that it suggests a move towards something approaching reconciliation. Yet how are we to expect reconciliation in a context in which the underlying drivers of conflict remain unchanged, when those who benefited most from the conflict stand to keep what they gained at others' expense? In exchange for what? The moral victory of their victims? What is the dialogue between those two groups going to sound like? Dialogue's hard to imagine in these circumstances, in the midst of polarization and continuing violence. It needs to go on, and the fact that in the Colombian case it did so, in spite of the conflict, was crucial. But the conflict is still not over in a very real sense. The dialogue that goes on now, such as it is drowned out by the atrocities that go on unchecked almost daily. Those who supported the agreement constantly invoked peace with social justice. Social justice, however, has never really been on the agenda in Colombia. But surely, if dialogue can't be about that, then it's not really a dialogue at all. Of course, not all sides will agree on it, but justice needs to be at the heart of the conversations that sites of conscience seek to promote. And that's it from me for now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And so with all of that to fuel our fires for discussions, we are going to drop into some small groups and have about 10 minutes to chat with each other about what at the heart of making dialogue work for each of you. All right, Linda, would you open the small rooms? We have one room that is entirely for Spanish speakers. We are going to assign folks as best we can. If you want to be in a particular language room, I want to be in an English speaking room, I want to be in a Spanish speaking room, please let us know and we will move you. Otherwise, enjoy your groups. All right, Becky and Yassine, can we help you get to your rooms? What can we do to help you get there? All right. Yassine. Do you need anything? And Francesco, we see that you are joining right now. And Anameni, what? How are you doing, man?
Okay, I'm assigning
Yep.
Enemy and Francesca to rooms, just so.
Francesca, would you like to be in an English or a Spanish speaking room?
No, Francesca's Italian.
Still asking. If you know, you know, that's good. Dennis, thanks for being able to join. And where we are, everybody who's just coming on, we are have finished our first round of speakers, are going to small groups to talk about what is at the heart of dialogue. Dennis, how are you today?
I am fine. Sorry, I confused the time.
It's okay. That's been happening lately. We're in that time zone change, so it's okay.
I was
Ashley, do
watching-
you want a room?
Hang on. Yeah. Okay. So go ahead, Dennis.
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I'm trying to do real work.
That's okay.
How are you?
Just asking.
I'm sorry. I really am. I'm listening. It sounds great. It's a good crowd. Oh, that's great. All right. I'm here if you need me, really. Lindy, so you have to leave soon, you said?
Yeah, so I have to leave at, well, the call's at 9.
Okay.
I think, let me check and make, I say that, let me check and make sure. I feel like all week, every time has been.
I know this week it's really, it's like, it's, yeah, I feel you.
Yeah, at 9. Talk
Okay,
to the
sorry, I'm trying to
Ford
prepare for
folks.
this webinar at 10 and Daniel from Single Mothers Association of Kenya just sent his slides like right now. So we have to redo this slide. Show that we did. All right, I'm here if you need me. I'm gonna disappear again though.
Okay,
All right. Okay. Actually, Rob, while you're there, can you hear me, Rob?
Yes, can you hear me?
Hi, how are you? Yes.
Good.
So I just wanted to touch base about tomorrow. It's that strange UN event that we're doing at 9 a.m. I told
Yes.
Camilla she's just gonna talk directly with you. I think it's like she knows you so well, and it's gonna be a little different. We're gonna email you the link and at 8:40, and you're gonna enter that way. Does that make sense?
Sure.
This is like, you know, Zoom really isn't my specialty anyway, but now we have to use somebody else's Zoom.
Ashley,
and
Ashley, I need to pause you for a
nerve-wracking.
second. Discovery B, is that Carmeet? Who is just joining us with Discovery B? We're in small breakout rooms and just want to make sure we assign you to the right room. So if you could unmute and just let us know who is behind the account Discovery B.
Human rights discourse is an ideological framework for a very unequal compromise through which the beneficiaries of past injustice are allowed to keep their accumulated gains, as if this itself were not a perpetuation of injustice. This is, and again I quote Meister, the humanitarian compromise that allows the self-described post-conflict society to move on by saying, now is never the time for justice. It will always be too soon until it's too late. So often the problem is that what passes for dialogue leads to an apparent consensus that it was the past that was bad, but that the present needs to be left well alone, apart from a few cosmetic changes. Indeed, those who see the underlying struggle as continuing into the present are often demonized as bad victims who won't leave the past alone. So how can memory practice support genuine dialogue? I'd say in the first instance by reminding us all that justice has to play a central role in any settlement, and by taking a part in the struggle, however difficult, to approach something like a societal consensus as to what justice might, indeed must, look like. And it can only do so by resolutely looking at the past, by not reducing everything to a massive competing perspectives, each with its own truth. As Leon Valencia commented in a conference in Oxford almost a decade ago now, todos tenemos nuestros muertos, we all have our dead. But to stubbornly demand that all violent acts be seen as equivalent, all equally reprehensible, all standing in contrast to a liberal democratic norm that effortlessly evades critique, is a perfect alibi for ignoring the structural violence that lies at the heart of so many conflicts, and in particular, in diverting attention from the private and public power accumulated by the shifting alliances of groups that dominate the states in which we all live. This is a tough ask, given that political approval and state funding often plays a key role in making memory practice possible. But institutions aren't monoliths. They themselves emerge from struggle, and yes, from dialogue too. In the Colombian case, the state recognized its role in the horrors of the past. That was crucial. A real conversation could at least begin, and memory practice in Colombia has emphasized this. Nonetheless, we need to insist on providing a platform for those perspectives that see a continuation of past violence into the present, however uncomfortable that may be. And it can only do so by engaging with social movements, and in the Colombian case, with those who've been the victims of an ongoing wave of violence that's only accelerated during the current pandemic.
Powerful stuff. Thank you. Dennis, last word on this right now. Dennis, I think you're on mute.
How heritage supports dialogue. In the previous group we were in, just mentioned a little bit that with the heritage rooted in reflections and actions that everyone has, when we join to do dialogue, it depends so much on our body language. And because all this body language we are bringing into dialogue are culturally oriented. They are all our cultural practices. For a mere example is how Indians say yes. When they say yes, they twist their head from left to right. And in many places, when you shake your head from left to right, that one you are saying no. But then for Indians, when they do that, it is kind of yes. Then they have got a slight shake up, which is in between. Then they have got no. But then in other places, for instance, in my place, when I want to say yes, I will nod my head. So if I'm in dialogue with an Indian, for example, and yes, we are conversing, we are in a level of making justice here, and we want to have a good future. When I'm confirming with my head, nodding, confirming yes, we are in agreement, for him or her, when they are not aware, they will see me as if I'm saying no. So then it means then that our heritage plays so much in consensus of dialogue. So when we are going into a space of dialogue, then trust has to be there. I have to be self-aware that these my cultural expressions are culturally oriented, and at the same time, being self-aware, I am open up of knowing the people I'm going to sit with. What does those simple gestures mean for them? For instance, just saying no or saying yes. So with that, it really confirms that our heritage plays so much role in dialogue. And when we go to dialogue and we only take our cultural expressions as the only right way of expressing issues, then we are going to disagree. For instance, even tonal variations. You find in some other communities, when someone wants to affirm the point, they lower the tone. And when they lower the tone, someone can say, no, now you are joking here. What are you saying? You need to raise up your tone. But then they're speaking from their cultural perspective. And other spaces, when someone is really affirming the point, they raise their tone. And that in other places, it would mean, are you getting angry? You mean you want to mess this conversation? So our heritage plays so much in dialogue that when we get engaged in such spaces, we have to be more aware, thinking outside the box, even outside our cultural practices and expressions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dennis. 4 really different kind of entry points to this one question that, as already said, is quite broad. We're going to drop back into those small groups and get a chance to spend another chunk of minutes thinking through this and trying to access a couple of these different entry points together. So the rooms will open up and we'll let you know when we get close to the end.
It's COVID-19. So this we have to face with scientific facts. And we have to accept other point of view. But of course, as long as their opinion are also based on truth and not in lies. There is, mainly after what happened in the United States, after the Trump era, there is a tendency of the fake news and the lies being assaulting the social media and the traditional media. So really, when we face lies, I think that's the limit of the dialogue. We cannot dialogue with somebody who is lying purposely, like being him, President Trump, President Bolsonaro, or any other president in Hungary or in Europe. That's it for the moment. Yeah.
Okay. Was that your final point there? Thank you.
Sorry? Yeah.
Was that the final point there? Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Apologies for the interruption there then. Okay. Lewis, may I ask you to take over next?
I will unmute. I think, I wrote my response, but I think it reflects very nicely what has already been said in terms of justice, in terms of action. Obviously, coming from an academic background, it's a bit critical. I'm not trying to say dialogue is meaningless, but I'm trying to say it comes with responsibility, right? So I would like to start with reading a quote from Patricia Hill Collins' book, Black Feminist Thought, where she discusses how epistemologies that embrace dialogue and ethical coalition building create possibilities for new versions of the truth to emerge. And she actually then uses a quote by Alice Walker's, from Alice Walker's book, In Search of Our Mother's Garden, which kind of shows which types of truth might emerge. So the quote starts, "In a conversation with her mother, Walker refines this epistemological vision. I believe that the truth about any subject only comes when all sides of the story are put together, and all their different meanings make one new one. Each writer writes the missing parts to the other writer's story, and the whole story, that's what I'm after." Her mother's response to Walker's vision of the possibilities of dialogue and coalitions hints at the difficulty of sustaining such dialogues across differences in power. "Well, I doubt if you can ever get the true missing parts of anything away from the white folks," says my mother softly, as to not offend the waitress who was just mopping up a table nearby. "They've sat on the truth so long. By now they've mashed the life out of it." So this is where the quote ends. And for me, it really immediately shows the limit of dialogue, and this is power difference. But of course also who gets to be the writer that she says is there, that can write the story, who gets to tell the story, and also what it was mentioned before, who is willing to listen to this story. Because as Sarah Ahmed really well argues in her book, Living a Feminist Life, when you expose a problem, you pose a problem. So it might just be assumed that the problem would go away when you just stopped talking or you went away. So so my question is what we need to be sure what is the point of dialogue and what is the aim, and how can we pretend that just dialogue, and I'm not saying you pretend this, but is a meaningful solution to centuries of injustices. So going back, I suppose, to a next point of justice needs to be at the center of dialogue. So what I'm trying to say is, and I can't imagine I'm telling you anything new in many ways, is it has to come with contextual understanding, taking responsibilities and action seriously. because there are so many tactics to derail also dialogue, like gaslighting, sea-lining, straw man arguments, concern trolling, and it's always on the minoritized and the oppressed groups to explain their stance, to take a side, to explain their side, to fight, to be heard, because also, of course, in what seems to be a genuine dialogue, power and history are not magically gone. So it maybe starts with acknowledging oppressions and injustices and structural inequalities, but without actually working towards better material and political conditions for those who are the oppressed. How valuable is dialogue? And this, of course, links to the limits of dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. Okay, and last but certainly not least, over to you, David.
It's a tough 3 acts to follow, I think. So like Los, I'll read. So to start, I'd say that there are clear lines where non-engagement is the right choice. And this is coming from the experience of the last few years of working on far-right extremism. So when people hold extremist, racist, extreme racist, prejudiced, violent viewpoints, I don't believe that anyone should feel they have to engage in dialogue with these people at any point. But I also want to respond a little bit to an idea in the question about restrictions and limits. And what I want to do in part is come out in praise of limitations in certain contexts. And what I mean here is that sometimes the creation of spaces of specified non-engagement can be necessary and liberating spaces. So if we're thinking about of engaging in dialogue with marginalized groups, minority groups, oppressed groups, there is a liberating role for spaces that have limits and spaces that exclude. The creation of in-group spaces of dialogue that exclude others, which can allow for dialogue that isn't silenced by dominant or more powerful groups. And this takes us round to the limits of dialogue, because of course there are always limits, the limits of who can participate and who can't, limits of time, topic, space, and limits imposed either knowingly or unknowingly by those taking part. And those spaces that I've just mentioned have limits that create a space for better dialogue internally, but they also then have limits imposed on them from the outside, to which we all have a broader responsibility. We ended our last workshop being asked about what the partnership between the coalition and the university could bring. So I'll focus a little bit on the university context, where in the last few years, there's certainly been increased effort to create spaces of positively restricted dialogue. But no matter what might develop within these spaces, the limits that are imposed on them externally always remain in place. So I'm brought back a little bit to an exceptional talk last week by the museum researcher Carol Ann Dixon. And Dixon drew attention to the power of the boardroom in the museum, those closed off, often elitist decision-making spaces, usually dominated by those who already hold more power. And as long as dialogue in those spaces remains limited, then real change or real interaction gives way to tokenism and ill-thought-out gestures. And in such instances, limits are deeply embedded into any dialogue an organization might want to encourage. So of course, people shouldn't be expected to engage in a dialogue that is one-sided and that doesn't seek to engage evenly. Why engage in a dialogue if you don't feel like you're going to be listened to? This takes me back finally full circle to the question of when dialogue should be restricted. And I would argue that in addition to the need for some of these bigger and more proactive acts of restriction, there are also need for small acts of restriction. And these can also be thought of in the form of acts of self-restriction, that work which seeks to act against dominant power dynamics by opening up the potential for dialogue amongst different groups and ensuring that there is a space that is open to those who most often and most powerfully feel the intensity of social limits of dialogue.
Thank you very much, David. Well, thanks all of our speakers there for 4 really fascinating provocations. I think we'll go straight into the breakout groups then for 10 minutes, if we may, please.
I didn't go to the break.
Great, I'm signing out.
Okay.
I have to go.
Bye, Sarah.
Thank you very much. This was great.
It didn't send me to the breakout room. I don't know why.
Sure.
My connection was broken. Maybe that's the reason.
Oh no. Okay. Let me see. You are in that group. Let me add you to one of the groups. Would you prefer English or Spanish?
English.
Right.
You can go back to the same room I was in.
Do you remember what room that was?
Luis was in it, but I don't remember who else.
We'll try this room.
That it doesn't matter. It's just
We'll see. Great, thanks. And Charlene, good to see you here. Let me drop you into a room. And Yassine, we'll add you to room 7.
Prompt provocation. What do you want to learn or test explore about dialogue going forward? And I'm sure this will be addressed in multiplicity of different ways. So Miriam, could I ask you to kick off again, please?
Yes, our big, hairy, audacious goal in relation to what we do with dialogue is to promote and to plant the seeds of a microculture of dialogue. As I mentioned before, the background where I come from is not really propice to dialogue, but we definitely think that by a smart combination of dialogue techniques and the places of dialogues, meaning the places of where formerly there was oppression or difficult stories happening, those are the kind of places that are potentially the best places for dialogue, because they can invite the visitor in a very deep, personal, experiential encounter. And I think that also helps, in terms of mindset, when you go there and meet other people and you see the places for yourself, without necessarily having to read or having to be, pre-informed about the power of such places. I think so dialogue, culture of dialogue, and action. I think action is also a very good word to place in my answer, because all this is about inspiring people into action, but it's also about inspiring people into a true, I would say, apprenticeship and a discipline that enables us to view all the others as equal partners, as valid dialogue partners. The person who has an opposite view to us, the foreigner, the immigrant, people coming from different cultures, as people that are worth listening to. I think that's very important. And if I may use the words of Pope Francis, who speaks about dialogue in the following way, and I'm opening the quotes: "Peace will be lasting in the measure that we arm our children with the weapons of dialogue, that we teach them to fight the good fight of encounter and negotiation. In this way, we will bequeath to them a culture capable of devising strategies of life, not death, and of inclusion, not exclusion." Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Maurice?
Yes, I would like to take some words from Miriam that I think is basically what we all want here, is when he said dialogue must inspire people to action. And this is really true. And I think through dialogue, there are some points that we want to learn. And we have learned here in Brazil, basically by listening to the 80,000 visitors we have at the Resistance Memorial every year. We have another, I was telling to the group, when you have 80,000 people, and mainly young people, coming to visit a museum who talk about atrocities and violence and violation of human rights, that means that you have approximately 200 per day. 200 people coming every day to see, to listen, and to react, and to put in a notebook, because we have the visitor book, and in the visitor books, we learn a lot of thoughts that these young people, they have about the past. So therefore, I think that through dialogue, we have really to learn, first of all, my first point is to learn how to resist to negationism. We have and lies. We have a situation in the whole world, as I said before, where lies are being spread around. So we have to resist at that. And dialogue is one of the tools which give us to counteract these lies. We have to learn about tolerance and respect, really, and non-discrimination. It's not because we are old and they are young, as some people. I don't believe, that the old people don't have a word to say to the young people, and the same thing, vice versa. The old people, these things of thinking of some of the old people who say, no, this was not like that in the past. I was not acting like that. You are wrong. These are words that we cannot really follow. And when we talk to the young people and when we listen to them, we learn how to not to discriminate, how to incentivize tolerance. So basically, this is the points that I think it's important. We have to explore other ways of also dialogues, through the art. There are a lot of things happening in the art, in the theaters, in movies, in art galleries, who talked about also dialogue for memory, truth, and justice. So basically, these are the points that I wanted to raise about what we learn and what we explore in the dialogue point of view.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Liz.
Yeah, I kind of want to continue or pick up where I finished the other one. So to come back to my previous point, change, of course, absolutely starts with acknowledging, and dialogue also starts with acknowledging oppressions, injustices, and structural inequalities. But as I said, this is not enough. If we are not actually and proactively working towards better material and political conditions of those who are oppressed, erased, or only allowed in on certain terms, how valuable is dialogue really? So at the moment, and at what moment does dialogue, for example, become making people rehearse their trauma for your understanding? And I work on heritage, so I take this a bit from a sort of heritage perspective, but like the way we in this country and in many countries do heritage, however well meant, is often quite literally a practice of reinscribing patterns of belonging and unbelonging. How else in many ways are we creating these national and local identities? And heritage is always selective, and in that way it's also future making. What worlds are we creating though by mobilizing only some pasts and not others? Aren't we colonizing the future by the way we do heritage at the moment? And can we even use heritage to build better ways? Because isn't it a master's tool, in Audre Lorde's words? So what I would like to explore, and I'm already exploring, is how we can shift the focus towards what comes not necessarily after dialogue, but like how to highlight the responsibilities of action that come with dialogue. Of course, this is an iterative process. And I think I suggested it in the previous workshop already, but I'm exploring care as a concept in this context, in these contexts of conscience, as a concept that can help in that process, I think. To make clear what I mean, I don't want to go in any kind of theoretical thing, don't worry, but I want to just give a small, very practical example of how I try to do this. Is the toppling of the statue of Colston, the slaver in Bristol last year by Black Lives Matter activists. I'm sure you've seen this. And what I find incredibly annoying is that the conversation in the heritage context continues to be around how and why should we keep or conserve this statue, or should we remove it? And why I think care is interesting is because care can raise the question, not just how do we care for the statue, but who is not being cared for through caring for the statue. So, and this is a question, of course, that applies in the past, the present, and the future. So who in the past, the present, or the future is not being cared for by caring for this statue? And why I like it is not, it kind of means you have to pick a side. It kind of means you have to say who you care for more. And I think Sarah Matt's words here are also quite helpful for me again. It's this is a quote again, it's caring is anxious, she says. To be full of care and to be careful is to take care of the things by becoming anxious about their future, where the future is embodied in the fragility of an object whose persistence matters. So this is where the quote ends. So the fragility of an object whose persistence matters to you. You care, right? It's a political choice what matters to you, and not everything matters in the same way to the same people. Even, you know, not everything matters in the same way. So decades of campaigning and many a dialogue did not remove that statue of the slaver. Protested. So there are power differences in dialogue constantly, and dialogue can quite easily become a way of dealing with the issue without dealing with the issue. And to translate this to care again, is like caring about, but not really caring for. So in a way, I think, you know, what we've been talking about and this is a concept I would like to explore, to highlight these issues, and at the same time to say, with Karen Salt's recent research around this, is that she argued refusal of dialogue should also be part of the options. And I think that is also what David argued, which is really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. David?
Thank you. I tried to avoid a focus too much on the far right in my previous answer, but unfortunately I do go towards that here. But I want to respond to the question with a bit of a personal story. So early in my PhD, I was trying to get to grips with the ecology of far right groups around the country. And this research brought me into contact with a newspaper expose of members of a far right extremist group in Scotland. And the journalists met with a recruiter from this organization as part of their investigation. And this recruiter, I quickly discovered, was a childhood friend of mine. And this itself is quite a shock to the system, but in some ways my particular upbringing made this even more shocking. So I grew up in the Outer Hebrides, which is a small string of very sparsely populated islands off the northwest coast of Scotland. And the quietness of the rural upbringing somehow made this development feel much more intense. It made me question even more than before just how someone might be drawn to these extreme viewpoints. This person had a similar upbringing to me. We moved away to a bigger city around the same age, and then our paths radically diverged. So how does somebody end up going down that path? And if somebody can be taken down that route, what can be done to bring them back? And I'd like to respond to this by sharing 2 points that I think respond to this question of what we want to explore about dialogue. The first point is on bringing people back from extreme positions. And I caveat this by saying that I don't think that it is in any way the responsibility of sites of conscience to engage with extreme racist viewpoints. In fact, I very much believe that they shouldn't be doing that. But let's take 2 possible scenarios. And in scenario A, someone is already on a journey back from the extreme. And at this point, we might ask what role dialogue can play in supporting their return, supporting their questioning, and also in learning the lessons, not only from their radicalization, but also from their process of de-radicalization. In scenario B, someone with a tendency to extremist viewpoints might visit a site of conscience. And by this, I don't mean an instance like a far-right group turning up at a museum, as Ian Watson mentioned last week, but perhaps they arrive as a tourist or a visitor on a family trip, anything like this. We need to remember, it's particularly made clear by the storming of the Capitol a few weeks ago, these people on the far right are not distinct from people that we interact with in our everyday lives. They have, you know, fairly standard backgrounds, broadly speak. But they're engaged in a dialogue when they arrive with the site itself. So we might ask what role the site of conscience can play in instigating an act of questioning on an internal level. Can a dialogue that promotes human rights, empathy, or those feelings that we mentioned last week as being at the heart of what a site of conscience is, can they play a role in combating extremism? My second point here is that the role that dialogue can play before radicalization. This links us back to previous conversations about the role of education. So can dialogue with and facilitated by a site of conscience help prevent people from embarking on that journey towards extremism and division in the first place? What forms of dialogue are best placed to achieve this goal? And how can this become embedded in our education? By education here, I think we probably need to be thinking in terms of lifelong learning. So how can different forms of dialogue fulfill that role at different stages of life? And what tools will be most effective in different contexts? How can we use these forms of dialogue positively at a time that perhaps when in-person dialogue is difficult? How can we use it to combat the effects of those digital rabbit holes of racism and conspiracy that so many people, particularly young people, are falling into right now? I think these are significant challenges that come with exploring the potential of dialogue at a historic site when we seek to promote human rights, equality, empathy, care, or love.
Thank you very much, David. Okay, we'll go straight, I think, into our breakout groups again to consider some of those things that the speakers have raised so well.
But we want to do one last thing with everybody today. And that is, right, we've started so many conversations. We've headed down so many different threads. Just popping into a couple of small groups, you can see there's a rich, deep conversation to explore here. And as I loved in the way one of our groups just ended, somebody was like, email me. Yes. Politely and with consideration and not demanding, please contact people, ask for emails, try and find ways to be in contact and connection, continue work, continue exploration together. But we do know that, right, one of the ways we want to try and make sense of all of that we've started today. That doesn't mean we have final answers, but we do want to try and get our hands around it a little bit. And so the way we're going to do that, are people familiar with the form of poetry known as haiku? Seeing some nods, right? It is a complex and rich form of poetry with many, many different facets to it. The kind of most rudimentary structure of it, though, and if there's any poetry scholars on the call, they'll be very unhappy that we're simplifying things so much, is the idea that it has 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second, and 5 syllables in the third, right? So it's a poetry with 5, 7, 5. Yep, thanks, whoever was writing there. Here's an example of a very famous haiku, right? What we're gonna ask you to do is we're gonna go back into our small groups, and we would love you to summarize your thoughts for the day, synthesize them in the form of a haiku as a group. So as a group, write a poem with 3 lines, 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second, and 5 again in the third, knowing that we are using English and Spanish from multiple continents. You know, there may be different syllables in some of the words. Good. Use that flexibility. Any questions? Are you all terrified? It'll be great. All right, we're gonna open the rooms. You'll have about 10 minutes and we'll see what we can come up with. Miriam, do you remember what room you were in?
Number 2, I think.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's good to see you again. Your Coolio line from the other day is
Yeah, I couldn't place that one today.
it's still the best thing I've heard in a webinar in a while.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. How do we do? How'd that go? Getting thumbs up. We made it through. It wasn't too terrifying. All right. Can we have each, these are pretty quick to share out. So can we have each of the groups go around and just share your haiku with us real quick? Any volunteers? And throw it in the chat box if you would at the same time.
So I'm happy to go from my group because I'm so excited I learned how to use the whiteboard, so we work together. So
nice, nice.
So it is, I just put it in the chat room, which hopefully you can see. We cheated and also titled ours to get some other words in. Portal of compassion, place of otherness, untamed yet reconciling human beings all.
Nice. Yay.
Great team to work with.
Good job. Can you try putting it in the chat box again? You might have messaged somebody individually. Didn't show up.
Oh, there it is. Sorry. I had not hit return.
There you go. All right. Nicely done. And thanks for getting us started. One of the other groups.
I'll go for our group.
Yeah.
Did you have it written down? Did you want to actually put it in the chat? And I'll just read it out because I don't have it written down, or I don't have it on the computer. But we had written, we just called ours dialogue. And we wrote justice and tension, your responsibility to listen and act.
Oh, very nice. Yay. Good job. Nice.
I can go for our group, although I'm not
Sure.
entirely sure whether we have the full haiku, but we had in our group Dan, and Dan is a kind of a poetry expert by affiliation and friendship. So we also brought in kind of the element of seasons that is common to haiku. So we add up the ante with the haikus. So we said, imagine oneself, autumnal inheritance, a careful action.
Very nice. Very nice. And upping the ante, yes, of including seasonality. It was good. One of our wonderful interpreters and I, Rob, started to talk about other forms of this on the call, and there's it was there are more complexities to this than I laid out. Yeah, you're gonna put it all in there. Excellent. All right, I think 2 groups left.
I think Alba can put ours in Spanish.
And read it in Spanish. We have translation. If you've been engaging in English the whole time, use the chat box in the bottom, or the button in the bottom right to turn on, make sure you're listening on the English channel.
Yes, ours in Spanish, it's generaciones buscando luchar contra.
Generations seeking to fight against denialism.
Literally, we've got kind of generations looking to fight against negationism. That's a word in English, but you know what I mean.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. Well done. Well done. If you can throw that in the chat box, that would be good. All right, last group. There was one more, yes?
I can go for our group. We don't have a title for ours. Justice, truth, safety, seek intergeneration, start from where we are.
Nice. Nice. Oh, we got a question mark in there. Beautiful. All right. So yeah. Well done pulling together a bunch of these threads, right? And kind of leaving us with a lot of the questions and issues and threads for us to follow as we go forward. As we kind of come to the close at the end of the day, is there anything that's a big outstanding question, a thought that you're going to take with you, a way that you want to follow this up as we kind of close our day here together? What's stuff that you're going to take with you as you go away today? Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, I'll say something. It was just provoked by a comment from Paul, who's left us now because he had to go from our group. And it's something about, he said, you know, we've been talking about concepts and, you know, intellectual ideas of dialogue and maybe conscience too, as well. But he said, we need more heart. And so I found that was really interesting as a kind of, you know, a question about where we begin, whether we begin with principles and our own moral positions, our own senses of what's right and wrong, whether we begin with the concepts, whether we begin with kind of bottoming out ideas and figuring out what terms mean and that kind of thing, and the kind of tension between them. And I'm not sure I know the right way around, or whether it's possible to order them, or whether they're always, you know, entangled together. But I think that's the reason I bring it up, is because it's kind of interesting about the actual dialogue that we are all in right now, in terms of bringing together different groups and the different kinds of agendas that are coming into contact in this particular space, and how we can reach across those.
Beautiful, thank you. And to that point, this is your last moments if you want to privately message somebody and say, hey, that thing you said was amazing. Can we have coffee virtually? Like, do that. Take advantage of that now. This is that moment to use that message feature. Linda, you have a survey, because this is an exploration for us, and we are trying to figure out how to do this.
I do have a survey. I just put the link in the chat room. If you were here last week, it's the same survey, just put the different date, because you may have learned or thought different things from this one. If you weren't here last time, it's a brief survey, I promise. But we have found it, you know, our little planning team of Braden, Chris, Joanne, and I have found the responses from last week super useful as we begin to think about moving forward, because our goal, as everybody has said, moving forward, is that we figure out more ways to have these kinds of deep conversations between all of you folks at Newcastle and all of us here at the coalition. So the survey will be critical to help us make the case for the reasons why we need to continue to have these conversations. So it's right there, fill it out. It'll take you 5 minutes, I promise. That's it, Braden, from me.
Thanks. And Lois, like, giving people follow-up activities. Beautiful. Yeah, and so we are coming up at the top of the hour here. I think Chris was laying out some of our challenge beautifully there. Dennis was talking to us before, and so many of the speakers giving us really interesting parts of this. So maybe as we all go away, we can, in our next day or so ahead, do as somebody had said at the beginning of this, and just start with that listening piece, and see what happens when we hear somebody else, when we listen for those barriers, for the way that the cultural heritage we bring with us is pushing us together or pushing us apart, and just try and understand the complexity of another human and just see where that takes us. And we'll all keep exploring and figuring this out together. All right. Thank you all so much for joining, spending so much time, sharing so much wisdom and knowledge and perspective. And we look forward to having many more interactions and connections and intersections as we all travel forward. Thanks for coming. We'll see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you.